I think the reality is a lot of companies, it's the opposite of zero trust. When they hire people, they put someone in place, they claim permissions of somebody else that's perhaps there already, and that guy's previously been in 3 other departments, poisoned in that department. And they have, well, actually, if they even know what they have access to, I think that quite often it's excessive, the amount of trust that people have by default. And I sometimes put this down to, it's an intangibility problem. I think that people don't think that because the data is digital, because it's not physical, that it doesn't have as much value. So they don't think about data in the same way that perhaps they used to. I quite often use this example. When my dad worked in shipping, whenever he wanted to get sensitive data, had any sensitive data, he had a locked briefcase that he kept in a safe in a room that was locked, was covered by CCTV, and it was treated like absolute gold. Whereas I dare say that information is now somewhere on an open share that's accessible to 20 other people, or more likely, no one has a clue who's got access to it. And the chances of that data getting screwed now, as opposed to the old way, is significantly greater, because we just lost respect for data, I think, fundamentally. So I really like this idea of going back and saying that the default stance should be like, people need to earn the right to have access to sensitive data. And when I mean earn the right, that shouldn't be, well, I've earned the right because I've been employed and I've been given a valid username and password. It has to be more than that, but you're totally right that obviously, you need to make sure that username and password, the way that people authenticate, that's the route. You've got to make sure you get that bit right, definitely,
and then you're also adding, once that's, you're absolutely right. The people need to take a phased approach to this. It's not as I do everything at once. It's what you have to do is look for the highest risk areas first. And places I recommend is things like third-party contractors, temporary workers,
definitely,
critical staff who have access to your highly sensitive, data, whether it being accountants, or you have your legal team. So looking at the really high sensitive areas of the business, and really focusing on those first. And if you get those right, and you make sure you do it in a way that doesn't create friction, because ultimately our goal is to help employees be successful.
It's a productivity thing.
Exactly. And you want to make sure you do a balance. So, and zero trust doesn't have that. It's actually creates friction. It creates negativity. And I prefer, that's why I call it building trust or digital trust, because it focuses at what you're trying to achieve is, you're absolutely right, earning the right to access that information. Making sure that you go through the right controls and satisfy the right controls to earn that right. And also, not only once you earn the right, you have to continually maintain the right, meaning that if the risk ever changes. So I always like security to refer to it as like a living organism. We refer to these neural networks and artificial intelligence, which I hate the terms, but ultimately we need to get security where it's adaptive. It's almost like a living organism, and that is like, let's say a new NotPetya comes out in the industry and a new major threat that's targeting organizations, that you can simply, just like you do in a volume control on an amplifier, you can switch that basically threat level and say the threat level is now increased, so therefore my security controls are increased. My security fence is actually increased. And it gets to the point where on a day-to-day basis, normal operations, users might have usernames, passwords, multi-factor, they might have biometrics. And then all of a sudden, a major threat comes out, and you might find it, well, those security controls, I want to make sure that it's least friction to employees. But for these systems that are highly sensitive, I just want to request a little bit higher security controls. And they might say session recording, least privilege. You might say, additional auditing or access workflows of peer reviews. So you just have that adaptability, saying that as the threat increases, I can increase my security controls. And as it decreases and goes away, I can decrease it. So it means that your friction level becomes much less. It means that employees aren't being interrupted and aren't being disrupted.
Justified disruption. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I feel that one of the big problems as well is that I think that at the core of it, a lot of people don't want to take responsibility for the data as well. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes in that they don't sort of connect up. Then when they think about security, they're not thinking about, well, what is it we really need to protect first, and then let's work our way out from there. Who are our highest risk employees, highest risk users, and let's start there. I think that's quite often not the mentality that's taken. It's all, and I think that it's quite daunting for a lot of companies to figure out, well, this is a massive shift for us to go from here to having zero trust for everybody. And I think that you're right. It has to be phased. It has to be starting off with, like, what are the things that we really want to protect? Who are the people? Who are the most at risk, or perhaps most vulnerable, highest impact users that we have in our organization? And let's start there. Let's start there and work our way out.
Yeah, absolutely. Companies need to treat data like it's gold.
They do. They do,
and they need to determine, well, how much is that gold value?
Exactly.
And if you need to put your gold in a bank, then you need to put the right security controls to protect it. So
you're right.
And we're getting to the point, to be honest, that the value of data is becoming more than gold and oil. And ultimately, I will say that data is. Going back to, I remember years ago a discussion that I had. It was in the early days of GDPR. And it was around 2011, 2012, and I was at a meeting. It was with the European Commission, and it was basically I was asking about what's the purpose GDPR? It's like punishing a bank for getting robbed against criminals. And that was my original opinion. That was my thought, and I was like, why are we doing this? Why are we punishing companies for criminals gaining access? And the minister, was a digital minister at the time, said, well, we had to look at this, is that data is now becoming very tangible, valuable asset, and to the point where it will become the leading value globally. Right. It's where basically companies will make their most profit from. It won't be physical assets; it'll be the data that they can actually intelligently use to make crucial, innovative decisions, or marketing, or targeting, or whatever it may be, or health related. So data will become extremely valuable. And even when the GDPR is explained to me, was that GDPR, it's a bit like shipping. To your point in the shipping side, is that international waters is like cyberspace. It's basically where data flows back and forward from port to port. And ultimately, in shipping, it's a flag, it's on the vessel that determines the legal boundaries of what's on that vessel. Right. And which is why you see most vessels having registered at the least regulated legal countries in the world. But the EU saw this similarity between GDPR and data and international maritime law and shipping. And ultimately, they kind of viewed data as being the containers on the vessel in cyberspace. And GDPR was the flag on the container to say where the boundaries and regulation adhere to. And it really got me really thinking about those boundaries and data becoming valuable and tangible. And therefore, organizations, and it got to the point where after that discussion, and after being involved in a number of incident responses and security breaches and doing digital forensics for those, I realized that many of these companies, the companies were not the victims. The companies were the secondary victim. It was their customers and the people that used. It was the consumers that were the victims, because they're the ones that data was being abused from identity theft, from financial fraud. Yes, the organizations may have had some temporary loss of data or value, but ultimately the people that ended up paying for it was the customers and citizens and consumers. Right. And that changed my mind into, well, ultimately you think about, well, yes, that means that those companies need to make sure they're doing best practices. GDPR does hold them accountable, and that there is a financial cost to them if they failure to protect that data, which is very tangible and very valuable to citizens. Because once it's lost, there's no way back. Once that data is out there, there's no, everyone who saw it, time to forget it. There's no Men in Black type of memory stick that you can clear people's data from the internet.
No, this is it.
Once it's there, I used to have a 30-second rule, is that the moment I put up a piece of data on the public internet, after 30 seconds, it's like getting, it's there forever. There's no going back. Because ultimately it gets scraped. It's in a server in a country where you have no legal boundaries to delete it. So it gets to the point where absolutely data, and it's so critical for companies. You've got companies who have business owners, business unit owners, general managers that's responsible for different aspects of the business. And ultimately, you need to have data owners. You need to have people that's assigned accountability and responsible of data within the business. Right. And it's their job to determine one is the risk. It's their job to determine the appropriate security controls.
They should be, but whether they do or not, I mean, this is quite often the case. I mean, I think that it's still not really perceived that. And I've got to stand up for them a little bit, because it is difficult. You're faced with a folder, and you don't know. You might not necessarily have that concept of what that means, that data means to the business, to make the right decisions for that, unless you actually have that understanding as well. It's difficult as well.
I had that challenge many years ago. I was involved in doing. So I worked in virtualization projects. So I was actually one of the architects for one of the world's largest virtualization, digitalization transformation projects. And it was interesting because at the time, it was all about what we were getting into was non-persistent VDI scenarios where that, it was like almost like little Lego building blocks where you pull all the pieces together, you create the VDI, and then when it was done, all those little building blocks would go away, get repurposed. And the persistent piece, which was your data, was what was basically maintained, kept, and then rebuilt again when you needed it. So you had these user profile management and persistent data that was then, pulled in when you needed it. Now, when we were going through that building of that, non-persistent VDI, what it really got into was around making sure that you could really kind of say, protect the data itself. So getting into understanding about the ownership and the responsibilities inside of things. And it really got into kind of looking at how we can really understand the data itself, how you can really classify it, and what was important. So I think for me, it was really critical that when you look into those environments and you're looking at building those architectures, that you really had to have that data impact assessment. You really need to look at what is that component, what is that critical piece, and really assign accountability ownerships. And it got into when I was looking at things like data loss prevention in those scenarios. You're looking at, well, I've got this data, I need to prevent it from being stolen. And in that environment, I looked at that piece of data and I thought, the data just changed so much. It was changing and evolving. It was aggregating. It was getting deleted. It was getting modified, new data. And ultimately, what I found was that the central piece of most data in the virtualization and that non-persistent VDI was the application that interfaced with it. So I find in data loss prevention, I find that I actually you may have terabytes of data. And I've seen, architecture designs and legal documents, and they just change from day to day. Small changes, small additions, appendices, adding, and it might mean that a simple, piece of data that gets added to one document completely changes the entire classification.
That's right. If they add one or two components, that data then becomes actually really, really dangerous as opposed to a little bit dangerous.
and simple things that I remember in GDPR, there were simple changes about in things like HR systems where they would add, let's say, just enable a simple field, which was, I think it was death. Is that person still alive or not? Are they deceased? And it was a simple flag that they decided to add in. And that changed the whole context and the whole legal ramifications of all the data that was kept in that database. And for me, when I was working in the virtualization environments, I realized that I couldn't do it at that little data level, that little user profile level. What I said was that it was the application. So I did end up looking at data loss prevention from an application saying, if you're using this application, this HR system, it's the HR system that has access to sensitive data and classified data. And I did DLP from that application. It meant that rather than having terabytes of data, some organizations then had to look at, well, out of my 2,000 or 3,000 applications, I now have a certain amount of applications that are classified as sensitive, that have risk, and therefore they need to have data owners and data accountability and data responsibility. So it became that those who are responsible for the application, and here in Estonia, we refer to applications as services. We don't look at it as a one component. We look at it as an end-to-end service. We call it service-defined networks, meaning that the ultimate thing is that it's what you're offering, what's the end service that the end user is receiving, and then the service is everything from basically the interface, the application, the protocols, the apps, to the data, to the authentication, to the identity. It incorporates all of that. So that's what you end up, you're going to get a service is that what needs to make that service available from end to end from all the components. And what you're really doing is also, hiding a lot of the things that the end user doesn't really need to see.
Sure.
So you're actually simplifying it as well. And ultimately it gets to that if you have service owners, if you get into, let's say HR is providing a talent service for the organization, finance team is providing budgetary services for the organization, that ultimately you have to look at it from service owners. So that's another level up from not just having a data owner or a application owner, but you have to have service owners. What is the service that's providing to that business internally or externally? And ultimately they become accountable and responsible for basically the risk assessment of the service.
Yeah.
And that looks at all the dependencies. It looks at all the interactions of people, process, technology, and then understanding about, well, what do you need to do to reduce that risks? And ultimately, I think when you get into services, defined as services focus, that means that you can also take a very good risk perspective as well.
Right.
You can also step back. So I think that's what's crucial, is that we really, need to evolve, and we do have to have people that is accountable, responsible, and they can pull in, different teams. They can pull in the IT team to help them with the technology. They can pull in the security team to help them with the risk assessments. They can pull in the finance team to help them with the budgetary side of things. So it has to be that basically multiple faceted, kind of interaction. But ultimately, you do need a service owner in the business.